Ah, Smart Water, now in a sleek can.
This feels cool, literally.
Perfect for social gatherings and on the go.
Should I start wearing turtlenecks?
One sip at a time, friend. Smart Water cans, for those with a taste for taste. Get yours today.
So good, so good, so good.
Great gifts for dad? We've got them, and they're up to 60% off at Nordstrom Rack stores now.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
They've got the best gifts.
Gotta show dad some love.
Snag amazing deals on Father's Day gifts from Cole Haan, Calvin Klein, Vince, and more. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Tudors Dynasty and Beyond. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show again, Dr. Stephen Veerapen. Welcome back, Stephen.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you very much for having me again.
I love having you on the show because you have such a depth of knowledge on things that we don't normally cover here on Tudors Dynasty, and you really are part of that and beyond that I've recently added for the marketing of the show. And today we're talking about witchcraft, and in particular, probably witchcraft under the reign of James I or James VI of Scotland. But to get started, I would really love to talk about witchcraft during the reign of Henry VIII. Was there anything going on during the reign of Henry VIII when it came to witchcraft? Because I feel like I never hear anything about it.
Yeah, there were no great witch panics or anything like that. When we think of witchcraft panics and mass trials and everything, we kind of think of the Puritans. We think of Salem. We think of the outbreaks under King James. We don't really think of Henry VIII. And it seems to be that Henry didn't have a huge interest in witches and witchcraft. The whole idea of witches and witchcraft went back hundreds of years. The Catholic Church had occasionally had an interest in it. And witchcraft seems to be one of those things that people accepted, or at least the majority accepted, as existing. But there was some kind of debate, particularly academic debate, about how serious it was, how much people that were thought of as being witches were just deluding themselves or were crazy and all of this sort of stuff. So there were some really serious Catholic theologians who were criticising the Catholic Church in the late 15th century, saying, this is a real problem. We should take it more seriously. We should do something about this. And you got occasional little pockets of interest and terror in Europe where some of these guys really were, we're cracking down on this. We're going to root out all the witches in our territory. But in England, it never really got on. Henry, as you well know, is very often accused of accusing Anne Boleyn of being a witch because of this rumour. And it was a rumour. We don't really know if he said it, but he said that he had been seduced into his marriage with Anne Boleyn by means of sortileges and charms. And I think one of the reports actually uses witchcraft, uses the word witchcraft. I think he probably did say this or did float the idea. This is when his marriage to Anne was going south, not quite as south as it would go, but it was going south in early 1536. And I think he possibly was looking at getting out of that marriage on the basis of canon law. So not common law, not criminal law or anything, but canon law, which could have dissolved a marriage technically if witchcraft had been one of the things that brought it about. It was then not a true marriage. Witchcraft had brought it about. If he thought about that, it clearly to Henry VIII was not as watertight a way out of the marriage. He found a much more brutal way out of that marriage. But then nothing for a few years apart from that. He's a little bit interested apparently in the Pilgrimage of Grace, about what witches or reputed witches might be saying about it. And then in 1542, his parliament passes the Witchcraft Act. And what happens as a result of that act? Nothing. Nothing at all. There's no huge crackdown on witches. People still aren't interested. Henry, I think, was trying to kind of set out his stall in religious terms. And this is something we'll come back to, I think, as we talk about James and Elizabeth. Henry had, as he would put it, not begun a new church, but restored the old church and sort of taken on this mantle as head of the church himself. It was, I suppose, incumbent on him then to think, okay, I'm in charge of this church. I'm setting the doctrine. I am setting the rules and everything. What do we think about witchcraft, guys? Come on, what do we think about witchcraft? It turns out no one really thought very much about it. England's problems, I think, at that time were much more about prophecies and false prophecies and things like this than they were about love potions and using witchcraft to find treasure. These are the things that were outlawed in Henry's Act. No one cared. People, I think, actually liked love potions. They liked buying love potions from quote-unquote witches. There was no great cry to get rid of this. So it kind of fell away and was eventually repealed. And then no more on witches under Henry VIII. Doesn't come back for 20 years.
Wow. Okay, so we go from Henry VIII. Let's jump to James VI of Scotland. So before he is King of England.
Yes. So James in Scotland, although we might actually have to go a bit further back than James, so still after Henry, we'll have to look at Mary Queen of Scots, my favourite Mary Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth, and what was going on in the early 1560s. So again, we think of witches and witchcraft and all this paranoia and madness and everything as being very kind of Jacobean, coming in with James. The laws didn't. In England and in Scotland, James did not start, he did in 1604 rewrite a witchcraft law, but it was under Elizabeth in England that really the witchcraft law was passed. So if we go to 1562, what do we find? What do we find in these very early years of Elizabeth I? We find something very similar to what was going on under Henry. Elizabeth, as you know, obviously was Protestant. She was really kind of, in those early years, carefully setting out the stall of what her religious settlement was going to be like. The more sort of reformist puritanical ministers always thought that she didn't go far enough. They wanted, it's too much like the Catholic Church. You need to get rid of vestments. You need to take things further, purify things more. And one of the things they were they were very kind of whiny about this, is you need to do something about witches. So we find in 1559, so literally like within a year of her becoming queen, we find her being kind of harassed by these more reformist ministers. Bishop Jewell, for example, saying there are more sorcerers and witches and wizards than ever in this realm. You need to do something about it. And she did. So she passed the 1562 Witchcraft Act. This was again setting out what Elizabeth's position on witchcraft was. And it was a kind of moderate one. It could still see people to the gallows, and it did. But it wasn't sort of causing widespread panics and widespread hunts or anything. What happens a year after that, north of the border in Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, Catholic Queen, is being harassed by Protestant ministers, the more puritanical-minded, to do something about all kinds of perceived problems. Lust, vice, witchcraft, just one crime of many, apparently. And so Scotland has its own Witchcraft Act passed. So these two acts are on the books. Don't be a witch. It's bad. We're going to get you. Don't do it. But again, apart from scattered cases, it doesn't really take off. Those scattered cases, I should say, still resulted sometimes in death and execution of completely innocent people. So under Elizabeth, we see occasional mass hangings. We see occasional sort of bursts of activity around it. The Windsor witches, Mother Waterhouse, Mother Dutton. We see these little outbreaks that we know about because they are written about in pamphlets and things. There's a public interest. So witchcraft is still seen as being such a kind of unusual, creepy, scary crime. And it still gets considered like a crime, like murder or theft or something. It's considered a real crime. But when it happens, it's a weird one. So you get the pamphlets being pumped out about it. You get all these kind of writings and things. People are interested in this kind of spooky crime when it's uncovered. And we see that going on in England and Scotland, just occasional kind of, I've seen it referred to as like background noise. It's never a massive problem or anything, but it's like occasionally some thieves would be hanged, occasionally some murderers would be caught and hanged, occasionally some witches would be caught and hanged. It's just another crime. It's not kind of national panic or anything until we get to James. So we're getting there. But the point is these laws exist. Witchcraft has already, by the time James comes of age, witchcraft has already been kind of known in Scotland and in England. Notice I'm not pointing at Ireland. It never really took off in Ireland. Wales, again, not really a huge problem. Occasional cases, but nothing major. In Scotland and England, the laws are very much on the books.
I'm so interested now, after you were talking about this, trying to figure out what was the origin of all of this. When did witchcraft become such a scandalous thing? And it seems like when you're saying it didn't happen in Ireland and it didn't happen in Wales and it was just in England and Scotland, did this all get stirred up because of religion and the changes of religion in these two countries?
I think, yes, with a kind of caveat. In those two countries, yes, because they became Protestant countries. And on the continent, we see Catholic witch panics. And what I think was going on is, and this still happens, I mean, it's not with witches maybe, but suppose opposing political parties, for example, today, still seem to find common enemies, people that we can both hate. We can all agree that X is bad and we're going to clamp down on it and we're going to stop it, even though these are supposedly different parties. Back in the day, it was, okay, we're Protestants, we're going to deal with these evil witches much better than the Catholics, and the Catholics will be saying, no, we're going to deal with these people much more strongly. So horrible, because it was an impossible crime. This is what makes witchcraft so unusual. They couldn't have done these things. They weren't flying, they weren't sort of causing death or anything, but you see tropes start to develop, particularly, again, thanks to this literature that's being pumped out. The press is putting out these pamphlets about so-and-so witches, however many witches here, however many there. They've been doing this, they've been doing that. And it was kind of common stuff. They've been feeding familiars on their blood. They have been spotted in the fields with black shaggy dogs. They have, at Scotland, it was often described as black men they were seen with. We don't know if that means black hair, black clothes, skin colour. It's not specified most of the time. What else were they up to? Oh, another favourite was using wax images and things, roasting wax images of people, sticking thorns in wax images. Elizabeth I got very interested when a wax image with Elizabeth on it was found with thorns sticking in it in Windsor.
Oh, scandalous.
Yeah. So these are the kind of things that the more the media, early modern media, was kind of talking about them, saying what they were up to, the more people started to see it and imagine it everywhere.
Wow, the parallels to modern day, it's pretty crazy when you put it that way, just how like word spreads. It just takes one news outlet or let's say one pamphlet to get out there for people to start talking about this like it's a big deal.
Yeah. It happens all the time. I mean, yeah, exactly right, Rebecca. Something that isn't a huge problem suddenly becomes a huge problem if everyone's talking about it, or if the media is encouraging people to talk about it.
Yeah. Wow. This is such a fun topic. And I know that might be weird to say fun, but it's interesting because it's different than what we normally discuss on this show. And I really, looking at James VI of Scotland, and I want to know what were his personal beliefs on witchcraft, and when did he start to have these? Is there any evidence of when this happened?
Yes, 1590. 1590, right into 1591. That was the birth of it. So we can pinpoint this really weirdly and unusually for history, kind of specifically. James, in the late 1580s was looking for a bride. He found one in Denmark, Anna of Denmark. He went over to Scandinavia, claimed his lovely 15-year-old bride, brought her back to Scotland. And the reason he'd had to go over to Scandinavia instead of just waiting for her to be shipped over was bizarre storms had really erupted in the North Sea, and they battered the coast of Scotland, really even by the standards of the Little Ice Age, 1500 to 1700. This was unusual weather, unusually bad weather. James at first didn't really seem to give this much thought. But then what happened is news began to come in from Denmark. So once Anna had been brought back to Scotland, she was being lodged in refurbished Holyrood House and everything, and it was all very happy and exciting. There were some investigations going on in Copenhagen in Denmark, and this is a horrible story, but the admiral of the fleet that had been in charge of bringing Anna over was kind of looking to cover his back. It looked like people were saying, you provisioned the fleet badly. That's why the new Queen of Scots' life was in danger. And he said, no, I provisioned the ships perfectly. This was something else. Something else caused these inclement storms, inclement weather. And what happened, and this sets a really horrible pattern for Scotland, is an accused witch who had already been arrested, she was already in custody for other charges, was tortured again. And she was tortured into confessing that not only had she done whatever it was they'd accused her of in the first place, she'd also caused these storms through witchcraft. And she hadn't acted alone. She named other people. Those other people were brought in and they were tortured, and they confirmed it. So this was a kind of scandal. This was big news, attacks on royalty and everything. And I think it was the June of 1590, word arrived in Scotland of this. And James clearly thought, well, they couldn't have been working alone, these Danish witches. There must have been Scottish colleagues involved. And what we see happen almost exactly followed what had just happened in Copenhagen. An accused witch who had already been arrested on other charges confessed that she had been involved and named other people. And we start to see women who maybe had been sort of looked at through very jaundiced lenses already, confessing to things that they couldn't have done and that we know they didn't do because it's impossible. And what they were coming out with, I find really interesting, because according to reports and confessions, we don't have their word-for-word confessions, we have reports of their confessions, which is dodgy enough. But they're saying things that really they shouldn't have known. I don't think they were coming out with things that we find in earlier French trials, for example. I very much doubt that like a midwife from the central belt of Scotland or a maidservant from Trinent in the east coast was reading about confessions of French witches from the 1520s and 1530s. I doubt it. But they were coming out with very similar stuff to what had been sort of confessed in much earlier cases in other countries. What does that suggest? To me, it suggests that words were being put in their mouths. They were to confess to this, say you did this, and they were being tortured, so they did. So we see James's interest come alive at that time. It's in the wake of those storms in the North Sea, in the wake of his visit to Scandinavia, and very much in the wake of what the Danes had been doing with witches. He starts to see, this is something that should be taken seriously. And I think he sees really an opportunity. This sounds cynical. I don't mean it in that he was being cynical. I think he genuinely believed this. He sees a kind of position for himself as the hammer of the witches. Because one of the things, this happened in Scotland and in England, from Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, the Reformation wasn't seen by a lot of kind of more puritanical-minded people as the end of the journey. It was seen as, it wasn't the destination, it was seen as the beginning. They wanted to go further. So there was a lot of unfinished business with both Scotland and England's early Reformations. And I think James was saying, this is the position that we can take on witches. It's real, it's dangerous, it's tried to target me and my new wife personally, Therefore, I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to be God's champion. I'm going to be Satan's enemy. So this is when we start to see really a kind of hard position in Scotland being taken on witches. And it's also, I think, when we really start to see in Scotland and England, the role of the devil being kind of pushed. James is really behind this idea that witches aren't just witches. And even if people beforehand had thought, oh yeah, it must be devilish, James is very keen on saying, no, these are the devil's slaves. They've all sold their souls, all of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
In the wake of this big panic in 1590 to 91, he writes his book on witchcraft, demonology. That's him again, not just setting out his stall, but trying to sort of give the last word. This is what's real, this is what's fake, this is how you find witches, this is how you deal with witches. He writes it all down.
Hi, I'm Cyndi Lauper. My scalp was covered with psoriasis, which could lead to psoriatic arthritis. But Cosentix treats both.
Cosentix secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentix. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at Cosentix.com or 1-844-COSENTIX.
Cosentix works for me.
Ask your doctor about Cosentix.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Wow. How was that book received at the time?
I think it was received at the time. It wasn't released until 1597, so he spent a few years writing it. It became a bestseller. It became incredibly popular. All of his writings did, particularly when he became King of England. His Basilic and Doran, the book he wrote to Prince Henry, his son, that became a bestseller. I think a lot of people in England were curious about what his beliefs were. He was going to be their king, and then he became their king. They wanted to know what he was like and what he truly believed. What we find as well is, in the wake of that first kind of national panic, the 1590 to 91 panic, James uses the press again. And in London, what is printed is not his book. It wasn't, as I said, out until 1597, but an account of that whole, I suppose, terror. He really sponsored, he didn't write it, he sponsored a text called The News from Scotland, which told the whole story of these witches and how they had come so close to killing the king. But because the king was specially protected by God, he discovered the plot and foiled it. James goes to that well a lot. It's one of the things that I don't think is really appreciated about him. He was a master of propaganda. He loved a narrow escape story. I was nearly killed, but God protected me. I'm a hero. He did it with the gunpowder plot. He did it with the Gowrie conspiracy. He did it with the witches. So presenting himself as this great hero king.
Where do you think he learned that from? I mean, he was such a young king and had so many people influencing him. Where do you think he learned this propaganda and how to make himself look better?
I think he probably learned it by someone who never wanted him to learn that lesson, his tutor, George Buchanan. I suspect George Buchanan was filling his head with all kinds of other propaganda, anti-Mary Queen of Scots stuff, anti-monarchical stuff. I think James learned the lesson, propaganda, that's a thing, but I'm not going to use it the way he wants me to use it. I'm going to use it the way I want to use it.
Wow. Okay. So he writes this book. It's a bestseller. What happens? And hopefully I'm not fast forwarding too far. And if I am, we can go back. But what happens then when he becomes James the First of England? He is now the king. Does this change stuff as far as witchcraft and witch trials in England?
Well, just before we deposit him in England, in 1597, so when he published that book, that was in the wake of another one of those big panics. So there were two big witch hunts under James in Scotland. One was the one I spoke about, the the North Berwick witches, they were called, that raised the storms in the North Sea. Then in 1596 to 7, he actually works with the Scottish Kirk in trying to have another purge of witches, and there's another mass panic, and it's up the east coast and across the central belt. Not coincidentally, what we find in Scotland is that these big panics really happen where the royal writ runs. So James didn't have a huge amount of control in, for example, the Highlands and the Islands. Physically and geographically, it wasn't possible. So we don't see big witch panics there, but we do see them sort of up and down the bits that he controlled, which I kind of think is very deliberate, is where the royal writ really ran. So there's another big panic there, and that again is very much James and the Kirk, the Scottish Church, trying to stake out his position as the enemy of Satan. James is very keen on working with the Kirk, but being superior to it. And the Kirk is very keen on being not letting that happen, not having a monarch, a secular monarch, as head of the church. Again, with witches, they find a common enemy. So instead of being at each other's throats, kind of having different views on the position of the monarch in relation to the church, we think, oh, well, let's find someone we can both hate. Witches, let's hunt the witches. And then that peters out, thankfully, and he, in 1603, succeeds Elizabeth. So in between the witch panics in Scotland, there's that background noise again, just occasional sort of eruptions, nothing major. That had been the case throughout Elizabeth's reign in England, just scattered cases, occasional group cases, but certainly no big panics or anything, as James had driven twice in Scotland. So there's a kind of myth about James that annoys me a little bit, which he supposedly became much more civilized when he went to England. He gave up on all that witch nonsense. He didn't. What he kind of thought when he went to England, in fact, he said this, he said, I've come into the promised land. So he couldn't get out of Scotland fast enough when Elizabeth died. Like within weeks, he was off like a shot. And he thought that England and English monarchs hadn't made. He thought Elizabeth had absolute obedience. She hadn't, obviously, but he had a kind of very rosy view of being King of England. As he said, he'd taken on a towardly riding colt after having ridden a wild horse in Scotland, which is fair, I think, in that in Scotland, people had been trying to kill him. Maybe not witches, but people had been trying to kill him. He'd been kidnapped. There had been kidnap attempts. The Kirk had been constantly doing him down. That's why he really preferred England. And, when he went south, he had a new agenda. In fact, he had multiple agendas. One of them was unite Scotland and England into one country. And by that, he meant anglicise Scotland, get Scotland to take on English laws and English customs and the English church, which it didn't want. And the other was religious peace, which I think was a much higher and more noble aim, but an impossible one for the early 1600s. He wanted all the Protestant sects to get along and then to unite with the or reach at least some sort of accord with the Catholic Church, and everything would be rosy and lovely, no more wars, peace everywhere. So good goals. These were good goals. Did his interest in witchcraft die? No, because we still see him taking an interest. We actually see him saving lives in England. Why? Because when cases are brought to him, and again, the fact that they were brought to him and he took an interest demonstrates that he hadn't just turned his back on this. He could and did point to demonology and say, no, this case doesn't meet what I wrote in my book, therefore it's not real. This case doesn't meet the standards of evidence that I set down in my book. So he's still clearly interested, but interested in sort of being recognised as the guy that had the last word on witchcraft. He'd given the last word. So we
Yeah.
do see big panic. So we do see outbreaks in England, not national panics, but local ones. And we see this again throughout the century, throughout the 1600s. We see certain bits of England, Lancashire is one of them, the East Midlands is one of them, where there was a kind of dark reputation and a kind of generational thing going on, where once an area has got a name for being sort of touched by darkness, touched by witchcraft, it keeps happening. People there, again, are aware of it and start accusing each other over and over again. That had really happened in Scotland on a national level because the king had been driving it. So Scotland got a witchy reputation because it had been coming from the top. England had more sort of compact areas that got witchy reputations because they were driven by local leaders and local panics. Elizabeth hadn't been sort of top down saying, oh, the whole country's infested with witches. And then when James came to England, he wasn't saying that either. In fact, he was saying, Scotland made for rich pickings for the devil, but England is the promised land. The devil's not the problem here. So that's what we start to see in England is really pockets of just or outbreaks of panics. Famously, Matthew Hopkins after James's death. But yeah, there are no more national panics in Scotland while James is alive. There are after he dies, and there are no major English national panics, just these local ones.
I think it's interesting that, you previously said that James basically wanted to have more power than he had when he was in Scotland, and that when it came to the church, they just settled on witchcraft as their common argument. And then he goes to England. He becomes King James I, head of the Church of England, right? And now he has all the power he wanted, doesn't he?
Yes, exactly. That's it. He no longer has to kind of stake a claim. He's no longer in England having to say, no, I should be head of the church because I'm Satan's enemy. He is head of the church. It's part of the job in England. You just get it by default. Whereas in Scotland, he'd been trying to carve that out for himself. He'd been trying to achieve that title. In England, it was just given him. So he was quite happy.
I am curious, and I know this is definitely fast forwarding a little bit, but I want to know how James's attitude on witchcraft affected his children. Like, how did his attitude on witchcraft influence Charles I?
That's a really good question, actually. Not a huge amount, in that they never seem to have an intense interest in it. However, in Scotland, for example, it's 1628, so 1629, and then 1630. So we have, right after his death, within years of James's death in 1625, national panics again in Scotland, explosions of almost the whole central belt, the whole kind of governable part of the country, accusing each other of witchcraft. So something happened between 1597, when it kind of went to background noise again, just went quiet, occasional little cases, and then there's nothing for the rest of James's reign. The witch hunter king is no longer there. But Charles isn't there either when he becomes King of England, when James dies in 1625. And yet, boom, there's these explosions of witchcraft accusations again. I think what had happened, I suspect, is that James had educated people in Scotland into believing in it. So it just took a conjunction of kind of one of those historical historians things, a combination of factors is behind this. But the combination of factors, I think, is are people leading it? In fact, it's actually fairly simple with witchcraft. When you see these big panics and things, in every case, you can trace it back to someone whipping it up. Someone is driving it. It's a question that I've been asked is, why did these terrible things happen? And I suppose slightly misanthropic answer is people wanted them to happen. There were witch panics and witch hunts because people wanted them. People got wound up. People got whipped up into hate. And it took very little, I think, to kind of start a snowball effect. There wasn't always a snowball effect. That's the curious thing. Sometimes one person would be tortured, confessed, executed. Sometimes 5 people would, and it would stop there. Other times, it would just snowball. And it would, in Scotland, take over the country. In England, it would take over the county. It would really explode. Similar thing happened in America, obviously. Certain cases were just small, others exploded. Why? It's a bit of a weasel answer, but people are just unpredictable. You can't really predict when people will panic about something and when they will just brush it off.
Yeah.
But I should say, one of the things that I talk about in the book, getting not released for a while, but it's gone through the copy edit stage, so I don't think I'm allowed to make any more changes. One of the things running alongside all of this is political accusations of witchcraft, and that's something that I don't think is often really counted alongside, you know, the neighbourhood witch or the group of neighbourhood witches who are accused of having familiars and everything. Alongside that, at the very highest levels, this is going on for much longer than you would expect. So Mary Queen of Scots was accused of witchcraft. Bothwell, her third husband, was accused of witchcraft. The Earl of Leicester was accused of witchcraft. Cardinal Wolsey was accused of witchcraft. Charles Brandon, Suffolk, was accused of witchcraft. In James's reign, Esme Stuart was accused of bewitching the king. Buckingham was accused of witchcraft. He was accused of keeping witches as well. Dr. Lamb was his witch and his wizard. This is going on. Cromwell, not Thomas Cromwell, but Oliver Cromwell, witch, made a deal with the devil, apparently. All of this is going along and so not resulting in these people being actually formally charged or accused of anything like that, but it's keeping it alive. It's keeping the idea that witchcraft is alive, it's a danger, it's a real thing. At highest political levels, it's there. It's kind of an active agent.
Yeah. What about Anna of Denmark? Was she ever accused as queen of witchcraft?
No, she was never accused. Not that I've come across anyway. Never accused of witchcraft. She was accused of being a Catholic, and she was accused of all kinds of other things, adultery, lots of nonsense, but not witchcraft. And I've often wondered, what was her attitude towards witchcraft? Because it doesn't seem to have been as active as James's, and yet she was Danish, and it was her home country that caused what then happened in Scotland, and I suppose sometimes in Britain more widely as well. Certainly when Bothwell, this is not Mary Queen of Scots Bothwell, but his nephew, Bothwell, who was also accused of witchcraft. James accused him of witchcraft, and he wasn't just accused of witchcraft, but accused of being the kind of great leader of the witches that was behind that 1590 to 91 panic. And Anna spoke up for him. She kind of took his side and was accused of being in love with him, stupidly. But that indicates to me that she was slightly more sceptical than James. But one of the things that I should point out, this is not in any way to defend any of these horrible things that happened, but if we look at Europe at the time, continental Europe, witchcraft was a big deal. It was a big talking point. I think and I've seen this, I've read it in a lot of books, history books, where they'll say James had this kind of terrible medieval throwback attitude when it came to witches. That's not right. And what I mean there is the medieval period wasn't a kind of war on witches or anything like that. It was the Renaissance period. Similarly, we always think of medieval torture chambers and things. It was the Renaissance that really took a horrible, horrible turn into extreme tortures and all of this grotesque stuff. So I think the mistake is we always think of history as being a kind of progressive march into things getting better or more liberal and just more progressive, and it's not. Sadly, there are a lot of sidesteps, and witchcraft is probably a really good example of that, because to James, it absolutely was not the case that he was looking backwards he was very much looking forwards. He was at the cutting edge of academic thinking, and academic thinking, progressive to them, was, this is a great thing. We are finally sort of identifying a problem and getting rid of it. Problem is witches, this is how we deal with them. And there's all kinds of theological and academic debate about, so does the water test work, or deal by cold water? Does that work? Yes, it does, according to James. This is not backwards thinking to them, but forwards thinking.
It's fascinating to me that it seems like as these people in history became more intelligent, the Renaissance period, humanists, as they gained this knowledge is when they became more closed-minded.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, Rebecca, actually, a really good way of putting it, yeah. It's new certainties sort of became embedded, but they're absolutely not certain. These are very uncertain things, but people are taking very firm positions on them.
Yeah. Okay, so just out of curiosity, when it came to the witch trials and James the First, did he have any involvement in the trials? Did he have a final say, or was he just kind of standing back, letting his minions take care of it for him?
Oh no, he took an active interest. So he did something that Henry VIII, I think, had often done or occasionally done, which is personally interrogate people, so put people on the spot. James would get involved. So Henry would do this with suspected heretics occasionally. He would turn up decked out in white and have these theological discussions with them, and then try and have them taken away for execution. James did the same thing with witches. He had accused witches brought to him at Linlithgow Palace, for example. He really took an interest. I think he was like turning the wheels of the rack or anything like that, but he was personally interviewing these people. And this is not, again, seen as something seedy or weird. This is seen as a good thing, just as it was when Henry VIII did it. The king is meant to be the fount of justice. Here he is taking an active interest in matters judicial. He is showing himself to be absolutely at the head of the law.
Wow. I wasn't expecting that as the answer. I really thought as king, he would have just kind of sat back and let others take care of what he had already started.
Oh, there's a brilliant story from the early 1600s. So this is when he's in England, 1605. And this is him taking a different kind of position to what he'd done in Scotland. So again, being not much more sceptical, but much more insistent on his standards of evidence being rigorously adhered to. And this was a woman called Anne Gunter, who, with her father, had claimed that she, Anne, had been possessed. She was the victim of a pair of witches who had got her possessed. For some reason, again, just cultural factors, England really loved demonic possession as a result of witchcraft. That caught the imagination. All the pamphlets are pumping this out. People are going around in the 1590s under Elizabeth selling their services as exorcists. This is all going on. So this woman, Anne Gunter, claimed this, and the women she accused were investigated locally, declared innocent, let go, and she wasn't content to leave it there. She and her father went to the royal court when James was visiting Oxford, I think it was, and managed to get an audience and say, I have been targeted by witches. She was doing all these tricks. She was spitting up bits of straw and needles and things. She was throwing herself on the floor and contorting all of this. And James, again, had not given up his interest, very actively interested, and he ordered her to be sequestered, put into the care of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who took her on. He was quite sceptical of this. He and James allowed her to be courted by a man called Appleby. And immediately when she found a bit of romance was on the horizon, she completely abandoned this pretense of being possessed and admitted that her father had been giving her some sort of purgatives or something that were making her sick, all as part of this performance. We don't know what happened to her. We know that he was investigated in the Star Chamber, the father, but the Star Chamber couldn't execute or anything, so probably just fined. But James, again, saving lives as a result of this interest, because what he said was, I've written in demonology what the valid evidence of possession is. This is not it. This is someone faking it. And he was right, obviously.
Wow. Okay, so what? Yeah, he writes this book on demonology. What makes him an expert on this? Why does he think that he knows all of these
James
things?
was an expert on everything. Any topic that caught his mind. He was an expert on the dangers of smoking. He was an expert. I mean, he was an expert on kingship. He was king. He wrote on that. He had a kind of avid interest, and because this was a thing that was really hot in academia at the time, he was reading everything he could on it. So what made him an expert? The fact he was king and he decided that he was an expert, and it's actually an interesting text, demonology. He goes into what is valid evidence, what's invalid evidence. He goes into, for example, differences between possession, infestation, why werewolves aren't real. It's all in there.
Does he talk about vampires too?
Doesn't talk about vampires. He does talk, and this actually has quite I think, a dark legacy. So one of the questions, the book is a kind of Senecan dialogue, two characters asking one another questions. How do witches travel great distances? And one of the things he comes out with is, well, for the length of time they can hold their breath, their spirits can fly away and sort of incorporeally travel and things like that. That we see come back throughout the 17th century, so after James's death. We see it in Salem, for example, the idea of spectral evidence. How can that witch 5 doors down or 2 streets away be pinching me or throwing stones at me or something like that? James had given them an answer in that as well. They can clearly travel spectrally.
Like astral projection.
Like astral projection, yeah, exactly. They can be lying somewhere else, insensible, and their spectres are throwing stones or nipping, pinching and stuff like this. So James had put that in the book. The other thing that had a horrific afterlife was the devil's mark, which he was very keen on, or the witch's mark. So any kind of unusual mole or wart or
birthmark,
birthmark at all, that could be used as evidence. So he didn't invent this, but he did give it a lot of oxygen, give it a lot of publicity. So we start to see people throughout the century setting themselves up as prickers or prodders or brodders in Scotland, where they were going about with needles, inspecting people, poking them because the mark was meant to be insensible.
Every time I have you on the show and we talk about James or the Stuarts in general, I am just reminded every time how fascinating the Stuart dynasty is as well. Like, we focus so much on the Tudors, but the Stuarts, they had just as much drama, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. I think I would say this, obviously, because he's the person I've written about, but James particularly, just because his life was such a soap opera. As much as I love, and I'm working on Henry VIII as well for next year, but so much of it I found when I was writing about Henry VIII is explaining European politics and wars and treaties and things, which, interesting enough, but not personal. Not such and such a treaty was signed in such and such a date. With James, particularly in England, it's all interpersonal drama. So it's just all kind of soap opera stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Now, as a historian, I want to know, for me personally, I really love the personal dynamics, the relationships between people, and that's what I tend to focus on when I write. As a historian, what is it that you are really drawn to in these stories from history that you like to write about?
The personal dramas. Particularly for this period, Rebecca, because it's the period of personal monarchy. So the personality of the monarch and the attitudes. Again, witchcraft is a huge, I suppose, almost totemic example of this. Why did this happen? Why did it happen in Scotland? Why did it happen to the extent it did in Scotland? Because the national leader had a personal interest in it. That personal interest resulted in thousands of lives being taken. Just as Henry VIII's personal interest in war, for example, resulted in thousands of lives being lost on battlefields in Europe. This is not just personal monarchy, but personal monarchy that is having a really intense, measurable effect on people's lives.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, you mentioned that you are working on a book on this topic right now, right?
On witchcraft, yes. Yes, true. I've not been subtle about that, have I, at all? Due for publication in September, yeah.
What can people expect to find in this book?
They can expect, subtitled A King's Obsession, so they can expect quite a lot about James, quite a lot about James's attitude towards witchcraft, but it begins before James. So it's got a chapter, for example, on Elizabeth's witches. It's looking at the conditions that allowed James's interest to blossom. And then it looks at his legacy. So it's got a chapter on Salem, for example. It's got a chapter on Paisley witches, where I live, where there's a memorial. And how his writings and his beliefs and his attitudes didn't just die with him, but kept coming back and being repackaged. So we know, for example, that Matthew Hopkins, the infamous witchfinder general, had read James's book, used it as a kind of manual, in Hopkins's case, a manual to make money. It's about charging people to identify their witches and everything. So it became a kind of capitalist enterprise for him, I think.
This book sounds fascinating. I've really enjoyed this discussion today because it's funny to me because at the beginning I told you, like, this is not my comfort zone. I do not feel comfortable talking about witches.
Yeah. It's one of those things that I thought as well, it was very grim, I have to say, reading some of the stuff. I mean, decapitations I'm fine with. I've been reading about them for years, but some of the horrible torture processes and things, it was quite hard going. But I think they deserve to be told a lot of these stories because these were real people. I mean, these were actual people that must have been terrified. I mean, must have terrified into confessing. And the problem with it, again, it's not just the media, but once this had been going on for so long, people must have known what was expected of them. As soon as it became clear I'm going to be dragged in and accused of witchcraft, mostly women, I think about 85% women, after about 50 years of this, 20 years of this, 100 years, they could probably just quote exactly what was expected. And sadly and horrifyingly, it was very often more names. Who were you working with? Because the idea had developed that witches don't work alone, they work in communities. And eventually in Scotland, we get the word coven actually come into use in the mid 17th century, I think it was. And that's, again, more names. Name more people, accuse more people.
What message do you hope that your book on this topic conveys to people?
Oh, that's a good question. I hope it's interesting to people, but one of the things I kind of came round to thinking and then saying in the conclusion was we probably shouldn't be asking, why did these things happen? Because people have been asked that. Every book about witches, there's been a lot in the past, I've tried to answer that. I actually, as I was writing and working on it, thought, why didn't they happen more? Because people liked this stuff. It sounds, it's really horrible and, again, kind of misanthropic to say it, but it was so popular as an accusation. It was so popular in terms of playwrights. I mean, throughout the period of Shakespeare, after Shakespeare, playwrights are writing plays about witches, Witch of Edmonton, The Witch. People are flocking to see this stuff. They are flocking to buy pamphlets about it. It was massively popular. It was a kind of living, ongoing thing, a kind of infamous type of crime that I suppose it was early true crime. So if you think, what is a message to take from this book? It's if you like reading true crime stuff or watching true crime YouTube videos and Netflix documentaries, and I do, I'm a ghoul in that way, you know what was going on during this period. You know why it was so kind of popular and why it was so much written about and so much in the public eye and so much sort of subject to intense accusation and persecution, because people are ghoulish.
Yes,
They
they
always
do.
have.
Yes, we have been, haven't we? Okay, Stephen, if people want to buy your books, because this book on witchcraft and James the First that we're discussing right now is not the only book that you've written. You have written several books. So if anybody would like to read what you've written, where can they find it?
You should find them in either bookshops or on Amazon, I suppose, as well. There's the biography of James, the Wisest Fool. So that covers his entire life. That's a cradle to grave biography, whereas the witchcraft book will be about his interest in witches. But yeah, if people are interested, I have a website as well that lists all previous titles. So thank you very much.
I'll include a link in the show notes as well so people can easily find this. When is this new book coming out?
Oh, so in the UK, it's being published in September, and in the US, it's got a US publisher as well. I think it's January, I believe, with a different cover.
Well, of course. You know what? Sometimes I just wish the cover was the same. I always think the UK cover is better than the US cover. Every time.
I think the title's staying the same. What I don't like is when the titles change.
Yeah.
I think they're keeping the same title.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, Dr. Stephen Veerapen, thank you so much for coming on the show again today.
Thanks, Rebecca, for having me. Appreciate it.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.